You know those huge grain elevators over on Alice Street in the Worth Heights area of Fort Worth? The big concrete silos that look like giant gray towers sticking up into the sky? A lot of people drive by them and just think they're some abandoned industrial buildings. But the truth is, those things have been part of Fort Worth for almost 100 years. They were built way back in the 1920s, around 1924 to 1926, during a time when Fort Worth wasn't just known for cattle in the stockyards. Back then, this city was also a major hub for grain coming from farms all across North Texas and the Great Plains. Farmers would grow wheat, corn, and other crops out in the rural areas, and eventually a lot of that grain would end up right here in Fort Worth before being shipped across the country. That's where those elevators came in. The complex was built by a company called the Fort Worth Elevator and Warehouse Company, and the location was chosen very carefully. If you look at a map, you'll notice it sits right next to an old railroad corridor. That was the whole point. Trains were the lifeline of the grain business back then. Grain would arrive by truck or rail, it would be lifted up into the top of those tall towers, and then it would drop down through a network of chutes and conveyors into the giant concrete silos where it could be stored. Those silos worked kind of like massive storage batteries for grain. Each one could hold thousands of bushels. When a train showed up to haul grain somewhere else, workers would release it from the silos and load it directly into rail cars. It was a system built on gravity, machinery, and a lot of manual labor. At the time they were built, those towers were some of the tallest industrial structures in that part of Fort Worth. One of the head houses, that's the tall tower where all the machinery sits, reached nearly 200 feet into the air. Even today, you can see it from blocks away. For decades, the place was busy. Trains moving in and out, workers running the elevators, trucks bringing in grain from farms. It was part of the background noise of the neighborhood. But like a lot of old industrial sites, things eventually changed. By the late 20th century, the grain industry had modernized. Newer facilities were built in different locations, transportation systems changed, and little by little operations at the Worth Heights elevators slowed down. Eventually, the facility shut down completely. After that, the buildings just sat there. And once something that big gets abandoned, it doesn't take long before nature and time start taking over. Over the years, the structures began to deteriorate. Windows broke, metal rusted, weeds grew around the property, and the site slowly turned into one of those places that people were curious about, but probably shouldn't be wandering around in. That's also when the graffiti started appearing. If you've looked closely at the silos, you'll see huge painted letters and colorful designs climbing up the concrete walls. Some of it is pretty elaborate. Abandoned industrial places like this often become unofficial canvases for graffiti artists because the surfaces are huge and the buildings are out of the way. But the graffiti wasn't the only thing happening there. Because the place had been empty for so long, it started attracting trespassers, urban explorers, and sometimes people looking for shelter. Over the years, there were fires inside the buildings, illegal dumping, and a lot of complaints from neighbors who lived nearby. In fact, the city logged hundreds of police calls connected to the property. It basically became a magnet for trouble. Those buildings might look solid from the outside, but inside they're full of hazards. Open shafts, unstable floors, rusted ladders, and deep vertical drops where grain used to move through the system. Because of all that, the city of Fort Worth eventually declared the property substandard and hazardous. In simple terms, that means the structures were considered too dangerous to leave standing in their current condition. For years, there were discussions about what should happen to the elevators. Some people thought they should be preserved because they're part of the city's industrial history. Others, especially people living nearby, felt it had become too dangerous and too much of a problem for the neighborhood. Eventually, the decision moved toward demolition. So now those nearly 100-year-old silos that once stored grain from farms across Texas may soon be gone. After standing over Worth Heights for almost a century, they're being cleared away mainly for safety reasons. It's kind of strange when you think about it. For decades, those towers were part of the working economy of Fort Worth. Then they spent another few decades as silent landmarks, huge concrete reminders of the city's industrial past. And now they're right on the edge of disappearing completely. If you see them today with the graffiti on the sides and the weathered concrete, you're basically looking at one of the last pieces of Fort Worth's old grain industry still standing. And once they're demolished, a lot of people driving through that area might never even realize that those massive towers, the ones that used to dominate the skyline of Worth Heights, were ever there at all. Don't forget to subscribe.